Welcome back to Late Night Lamentations. Does God feel pain? Episode 3. The Weight. Psalm 78:40. How oft did they provoke him in the wilderness and grieve him in the desert? Psalm 95:10. 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, and said, it is a people that do err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. We're entering a new book, so you know what that means. We need some exposition. If you're reading your Bible in the traditional way, from Genesis to Revelation, this one is like 11 books after Judges. But maybe now is as good a time as any to do a brief breakdown of how most Bibles are structured. First, you've got the Law, or the Pentateuch, sometimes referred to as the Torah, and that's Genesis through Deuteronomy. Then you get the historical books, being that of Joshua through Esther. Then come the poetry and wisdom books, and that's Job through Song of Solomon. Then you've got the major prophets, Isaiah through Daniel, and you round off the Old Testament with the minor prophets, being that of Hosea through Malachi. We open the New Testament with the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then you get the history book, being that of the book of Acts, and you get the epistles, or the letters, and that's Romans through Jude. And finally, the Bible ends with the book of prophecy, being Revelation. And that's just a general gist. I could go into why John is technically a gospel, in that it covers Jesus' time on the earth, but it's written a bit differently than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I could also break the epistles down even further to outline that Paul's letters are to churches for the most part, but sometimes also to specific people. There are even some of the books like Hebrews are often attributed to Paul, but we don't know 100% who the author of that one is. Other details like that. But really, something that may help here is just knowing that the book of Psalms isn't set up chronologically in Israel's history. It's composed of writings that are from different points in that history. Some from Moses, some from a guy named Asaph, and mostly from David. It's similar to how Acts covers all of Paul's journey, and his letters afterwards take place throughout the book of Acts itself, but that's probably too much information that really isn't necessary at this point. We're also looking at 2 different verses here in this episode, but since they closely relay the same message and idea, I thought it'd be a good idea to include them in, a combo meal, I guess. So it's kind of like a Q&A session for Israel here, all centered around this idea about remembrance. Since books like Psalms and Proverbs are more like poems and wise one-liners, these are traditionally studied like volumes of fortune cookies, in a way. Faithful sayings and thoughts to think about once they're in front of you, and maybe to memorize, but not really digested and studied the same way that you would the book of Exodus or, Genesis or something like that, for example. If we keep to this remembrance theme when going into this episode, it'll make the rest of what we'll be discussing much easier to understand and digest, or carry, given the title of the video itself. Let's start with the question. How oft did they provoke him in the wilderness and grieve him in the desert? Tiny detail here that actually sticks out to me in a major way is this. This verse isn't phrased as a question, but as an exclamation. It's not saying,
how did this happen?
Well, I'll tell you. It's more saying, how can this be possible due to what we know happened? That's a small but crucial detail to what's being portrayed here in the passage. In the previous 2 episodes of this series, we looked at the Hebrew words for both grieved and repented, among some other ones. This time, we'll examine the word provoke. And Hebrew is an interesting language, and I by no means am even semi-fluent in it. Just personally, being honest with you, I'm really only super confident in my English here, but I've technically learned how to read and speak Spanish, and a bit of Korean too. And there was a time where I could understand and use ASL, sign language, to a pretty immediate level. But I don't know, I don't even know why I brought that up, but if you're curious as to how or why I keep bringing Hebrew into this series, it's because the original text of the Old Testament, to my understanding, was written in Hebrew. When we start getting into the New Testament passages, I'm going to transition from using Hebrew words to Greek words, because while it would be nice to just take the English translations as they are, we can't always get the clearest picture of what is being said in every situation. And even without that, I feel like it's good to double check certain words that seem important to contextualizing what these verses are saying. There's a whole thing, for example, where in the Ten Commandments it says, "Thou shalt not kill," back in Exodus. But when we jump later into the Gospels, Jesus will say, "Thou shalt do no murder." And the Hebrew word for kill in Exodus is rakshak. I don't know how to say it. But it's actually, that word actually is murder. So maybe that's not something big to you, but it's been used in online discourse before to point out a contradiction, where if people would actually look into the words, then they'd know that they're actually building on each other. But whatever. I mean, the Hebrew word for okay, wait. One more thing. I'm also not only using one source for the Hebrew identification that I've been doing. Either, if I was, I would just be listing it at the end. It'd be nice to just have one source that isn't without flaw, that can give a one-to-one translation of what we're talking about. But, this is the age of the internet, so I'll typically look up something like Hebrew word for blank, then go into a few different places online to verify. Hebrew is also known for using different words to express the same idea, and kind of vice versa sometimes, which isn't super uncommon, but it's important to point that out ahead of this episode. And you'll see why as we get into it. But anyway, we were talking about provoke, right? The Hebrew word for provoke is mara, maybe. I usually get the pronunciation down too before I start these, but there were a lot of different... It's on the screen. Okay? It means to make bitter, to rebel, or to be contentious. The psalmist that is attributed to this verse, if we look into what it says at the top of the page, or page of the psalm, the chapter itself, is Asaph. Scripture doesn't give us a ton of details about him, aside from the following verses that I'll put on screen that describe him as a Levite or worship leader appointed by David. And we haven't even gotten to him yet, really, in our discussion, but I'm sure we'll get there. But given what we know about the man himself, being Asaph, this psalm isn't like some of the others in the book that are poetic songs or something. This one serves as an institutional memory. It's written by someone whose job it was to help Israel remember who they were, what God has done, and why they kept forgetting. Let's look at the question itself again and ask, how often did Israel provoke God up to this point? Well,
it's a lot.
It depends on which book you want to look into, really, because both Exodus and Numbers are littered with different instances where this provocation takes place. If you look into Exodus, there's the incident at the Red Sea, the many times where Israel complained about food, and probably the biggest example before Numbers would be to examine, the case of the golden calf. If we look at Numbers, and remember when I said last episode that this was the most wilderness book we have in the Old Testament? Well, notable times when Israel questioned or outright declared their discontent with the Lord could be studied from chapter 11 all the way through 25. They complained about how hard this whole thing was in general. They had another series of gripes regarding food. There was even a time when Aaron, Moses' brother, opposed Moses. There's this whole thing with this Korah's rebellion arc, but the two big ones I can think of off the top of my head are the ones about the bronze serpent and the whole thing that we talked about last week regarding the 12 spies who were sent to scout out the land. So when I read this passage back in Psalm 78, I don't think it's meant as sort of a tally system, but rather that the verse is really calling out the absurdity of how Israel has not only rebelled multiple times, but that they're even doing it at all. But if the verse says, how often did they do this? The follow-up is naturally, after what exactly? And you know what? We're going to do it. We're going to go into probably the biggest answer to that question in Israel's history, because it's an absolute crime that we had to kind of gloss over it last time in last episode. In this next section, and for the majority of the rest of the video, we're going to discuss the 10 plagues. So back in early Exodus, and let's go all the way back, because if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Chapter 1 gives us an update on what has become of Abraham's family. Specifically, it identifies the growth that the Israelites experience as a direct result of what God was able to do through the life of Joseph. I'm tempted to tell you all about Joseph and why this is even the case in the first place, because his story is so much more, more than just a dude with a colorful coat, But I digress. Joseph made it so the Egyptians and the Israelites were in a pretty close spot together. It turns out saving an entire nation from 7 years of famine will do that to a pharaoh. But Joseph passes away, as all men do, and unfortunately, without him being around, the next pharaoh after the one he was buddies with begins to have a change of heart, as it were, towards the ever-growing Israelite nation. It says in verses 8 through 10, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land." This new king decides to put Israel into a state of slavery, but they don't even start off as rebelling outright. It even continues that they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, such as Pithom and Ramses, mentioning too that the Egyptians afflicted Israel. Well, the more that they afflicted Israel, the more they multiplied and grew. And this did not sit well with the king. Pharaoh continued to make conditions worse for them, going as far as commanding Hebrew midwives to kill any sons they may have, though any daughters were fine to keep. But what's cool is that the midwives didn't fear Pharaoh, they feared God. So they disobeyed and kept the boys around anyway. What happened when they did so? God gave them strength, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty, it says. Pharaoh responds to this by doing what any logical man would do, and in verse 22 declares that all of his people need to start throwing their sons into the river, but the daughters again are good to stay. Chapters 2 through 4 is where Moses is born. He's introduced, he's born, and prepared by God to rescue Israel from their captivity. We'll skim through this section, but not without mentioning some incredibly special moments. Obviously, Moses evades the aforementioned river dance, right? And it's interesting in its own right how that happens, but we won't get into that for now. Halfway through chapter 2, Moses sees an Israelite being beaten by an Egyptian guard and takes matters into his own hands, kills the dude on the spot, and hides him in the sand. The next day or so, Moses witnesses one of the Israelites fighting with another one of their own and rebukes them, saying, Brothers, 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 how does it make any sense to fight each other when we all live under the same oppression? To which these men reply, Who do you think you are, buddy? You think you're our leader? What are you gonna do? You gonna kill us if we don't obey you like you did that God from the other day? And this scares Moses, obviously, because I think it says in the text too, oh no, Moses then knew that the thing he had done had been known. Like he got caught. Murder happens to be generally frowned upon in even ancient societies. Pharaoh finds out about this and seeks to kill Moses in turn, so he leaves into another nearby country. Moses doesn't go away and hide for a week or two. This ends up being like multiple decades of his life. Like he even meets a woman, gets married. I think he has a kid. I'd have to read it again, but it's definitely not like, a 2-week vacation. Anyway, but the story here pauses on Moses and turns again to God and Israel. Chapter 2, verses 23 through 25 say, And it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. Haven't we heard something like this from another episode that we did? God knows. God sees. God has a way and a plan to execute justice with his judgment. See? It's cool. Whatever. Anyway, chapter 3 picks up with God giving Moses instruction via the burning bush. This is another chapter that's worth diving deeper into than just a summary, but whatever. You'll see very human examples of Moses' reaction to being chosen by God to be Israel's leader. Many times, God will be met with a series of excuses from Moses as he continually tries to reason with God that there has to be someone better suited for this position. A continual comfort is established here in verse 12, where God tells Moses, "Surely I will be with thee. You will not have to do all of this in your own strength." This chapter also contains that tangent that I went on in episode 1 of this series. Remember I had that, I think it was 2 minutes where I was talking about that whole I am that I am? And we could stop everything again and go into what that means and go over some of the interpretations I've seen in the modern day that really help instill this whole idea that the Bible is a living book. But, for now, we'll look at what actually sets up the whole 10 plagues thing, right? Because that's where this is going. Verses 18 through 22 have God breaking down to Moses exactly what will happen ahead of time. And it's like exactly what will happen. But the people of Israel will believe and listen to you. You'll tell Pharaoh that you guys gotta leave for a few days and make sacrifices unto the Lord your God. And he isn't gonna be cool with that field trip, regardless of the permission slip I just signed for you to do so. Because of that, I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders. And afterwards, he will eventually let you go. We move into chapter 4, and this is where God actually starts equipping Moses for the task ahead. You'll see a few more excuses. This is a big shocker at this point, but we're getting into another thing here that is, how you say, difficult doctrine to digest without deliberate discernment. Look at verses 21 through 23. God again gives Moses the play-by-play, but he says something really interesting. "When thou goes to return unto Egypt, see thou do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in thine hand. But I will harden his heart, that he shall not let the people go. And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And I will say unto thee, Let my son go, that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn." A couple things to dig into here. So, Hebrew actually has 3 different words that are translated into the KJV as harden. Let's make sure we know what we're talking about throughout the next couple of sections here. We have kebed, kasheh, or kasha, and chazak. I hope I'm saying these right. I'm really sorry if I'm not saying these right. Kebed means heavy, weighty, or burdensome. Kasheh means hard, difficult, severe, or stubborn. And chazak means to be strong, courageous, firm, or to prevail. While chazak is the one that is often used throughout the plagues era here, the other 2 do occur intermittently as well. You're not going to be tested at the end of this video about, which of the form of hardened was used in this verse or something like that. But, I just wanted to address the concern that's been made often by critics here who say Pharaoh wouldn't have done what he did had God not put the feeling into his heart. And, again, these critics don't just exist outside of the believer bubble. Many of us have found ourselves either exposed to or witnesses of in the past. So I'm not trying to villainize this concern. Just, add some insight into how it can be thought about based on, reading. I haven't even mentioned it yet, but you've been reading. You should be reading. Do whatever you want. Hey, whoa, don't throw that should in there, buddy. No. Anyway, Pharaoh was already a tyrannical and cruel king at this point. Okay, he shows us this through his actions leading up to God's breakdown before God even steps in to do anything. And he continues this behavior throughout the entirety of the plagues being cast upon Egypt. There are many times in this section where the Egyptians themselves are telling him, bro, this God of Israel is legit. We gotta stop this and give him what he wants and just let him go. And until Pharaoh loses his firstborn, he continues to let his pride dictate the state of the nation of Egypt during this period. When God hardens Pharaoh's heart, which it should be noted, doesn't even happen until 5 plagues have already afflicted Egypt. But, we're going to get there. But God is just giving Pharaoh more of the strength that he himself has already, set upon himself to lean on. It's much like how people will get nervous to do a difficult task that they want to do, so they use an outside source for motivation to get them through to the finish line. It's kind of like in Space Jam where they drink the Michael Jordan secret sauce and they perform better. The heart of Pharaoh already wants to punish the Israelites just because they exist at all. God just uses that feeling to expose Pharaoh's heart to others the same way that God himself has witnessed it in his past. This also lines up with what we said last episode about how God waits until the fullness of evil has fully been revealed before delivering judgment. Remember the whole Genesis 15:16 and the Sodom and Gomorrah thing in Genesis 18? In Exodus, God predicts that Pharaoh won't yield to the warnings, but it doesn't mean that if Pharaoh actually had a change of heart, that God still would have gone through with all 10 plagues as they're described. We don't know what might have happened. We can guess and speculate, but what we read here is what actually did happen. So much of what exists outside of that is free to debate and discuss, which is actually encouraged as an activity that God wants us to do. That'll be mentioned later in Scripture as well. Anyway, what about the plagues themselves? We've been dancing around for a few minutes here. How many minutes? Oh, maybe more than a few minutes here. Building exposition concerning how they were going to go down, but, how did they really go down? And what did they signify for the land of Egypt outside of just the deliverance of Israel from a tyrannical king? Exodus 5, chapter 5 through chapter 12. Right out the gate, Moses and Aaron do exactly as God says, and they bring his message to Pharaoh. The proposal itself is seen with such disgust by the king that even before the first plague happens, Pharaoh makes the slavery of Israel that much harder by telling them to not only continue working for free, but to work harder now, because I think they say, and they served with rigor, yes, that's the word, you didn't have to correct it. They say that later in the same thing before the first plague starts, but the real thing that caught my attention that I wanted to mention is that, they have to make bricks, right? One of their big things is making bricks, because, the Sphinx doesn't get built with straw, or they don't get built with mud by itself. Anyway, they have to make bricks, right? But Pharaoh makes the slavery that much harder by telling them to not only continue working for free, but now that when you make the bricks, you got to go and find the straw to do so yourselves instead of using the straw that is provided. So that alludes to the fact that there was straw provided beforehand, and then the shift starts and they got to turn the straw into bricks. I don't know how to make bricks, okay? I think that's how it works, but that's just what it says. When we reach chapter 7, the plague saga kicks off with a pretty big canon event. In verses 17 through 18, God says, "I will smite with the rod that is in mine hand upon the waters which are in the river, and they shall be turned to blood. And the fish that is in the river shall die, and the river shall stink, and the Egyptians shall loathe to drink of the water of the river." This is in direct opposition to the Egyptian gods known as Khnum and Hapi, or Happy. I should have looked that up too, how to say that. Khnum is known at this time to be the creator god, the being that formed man from clay like a potter. He's also who they would have attributed the title of guardian over Egypt. Hapi, is it Happy or Happy? H-A-P-I, brother. On the other hand, was the personification of the Nile itself, and the god of fertility. By being unable to stop this poisoning of the Nile, the God of Israel signals to Egyptians and Israelites alike that he is stronger than those who have just been mentioned. This plague was a big one to start off on, I think, as it technically challenges 3 different Egyptian gods in one chess move, if we include Osiris into the bunch as well, him being known for being the god of life and death, or of chaos, I think. This Nile was the single most important resource to Egypt at the time, if you think about it. We are in a desert land after all, and it's not like today where we have these systems in place to transport water to places where it's lacking, or that we should have those systems in place. That's another thing. Most nations would rely on Egypt as their go-to source for all things liquid, at least when it comes to water. And now that this has been compromised, this would have had a profound effects on the economy of Egypt at that time. And it's not just the Nile itself. The verses continue here to describe that even the pools of water inside stone and wooden structures were changed as well. So even if there were stockpiles of extra water lying around somewhere, which there probably were, like in pots and things like that, they too have been corrupted, leaving them unusable. Pharaoh responds by hardening his own heart, turning away from his people while this lasts for the next 7 days. After this, God tells Moses to return to Pharaoh and repeat the command from last time, "Let my people go that they may serve me." So this time though, God says that if Pharaoh refuses, he will send frogs to start popping up everywhere. From the borders of the city to the houses themselves, the bed chambers, bread factories, and broom closets, if a space can fit our four-legged amphibious friends, you're bound to find one. This plague spits in the face of the Egyptian goddess known as Heket. Heket was said to represent regeneration, rebirth, and fertility, resembling renewal and life. Oh, I should mention here too, before we get too far, that, into Pharaoh's response, that his magicians have been trying to keep up and replicate these plagues as they occur. Not entirely sure why myself, though, I think that I would like to think that if the magicians could replicate these, you'd think they'd be able to stop them, and I guess that's probably where Pharaoh's thinking was too at the time. Regardless, in both this plague and the one before it, the magicians actually do repeat the plagues themselves, though to what extent exactly, I'm not sure, as it's not stated in the text. Pharaoh responds to this plague by asking Moses to have God take away the frogs, and he'll let the Israelites go to worship and sacrifice their God. Which is great, great news, buddy. Good. He tells Moses that the Israelites can leave tomorrow. Moses goes back to God and asks him to get rid of the frogs, and he does, and Pharaoh sees that the frog carcasses have caused the land to stink, and he hardens his own heart and doesn't let them go. The pattern we begin to see that will continue on here, through the rest of them, is that Pharaoh says one thing, sees God remove the plague to some degree, decides within himself that since the crisis has been averted, he doesn't actually have to follow through with his word, and the cycle repeats. After he does this, God commands Moses to tell Aaron to smite the dust of the land that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And Aaron does so, and we see the magicians try to match this plague again with their own devices, and this time, they can't. They even tell Pharaoh in this passage that this is the finger of God. The Egyptian god that we can attribute this one to would be Geb, or Seb according to some sources, who is said to be the lord of the dust of the earth, or their earth god, if you want to think of it that way. It should be noted that this one would have been especially pointed at Egypt's religious leaders. Back then these guys would do just about anything to remain clean, from shaving their eyebrows to prevent parasites to removing their eyelashes themselves, having special shoes and stuff like that, and like very different clothes than other people in the land, and bathing in cold water twice a day and twice each night. And it's been debated on too as to whether it was actually lice in this plague too. Some translations will say ticks, mosquitoes, or flies, or something like that, but the idea is agreed upon that, throughout all of them, that whatever this was a creature that dug itself into the skin, and it's kind of gross. How does Pharaoh respond to this? Well, big surprise here, but he refused to listen to his advisors, and again, he hardens his own heart. When we reach verse 20, we see another command by the Lord thy God to Moses. This time he says the same thing as before, else if you won't, I will send swarms of flies upon thee, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, and unto thy houses, and the houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereon they are. Something cool that's different about this plague, though, is that this is the point in the story where God clearly carves out a special place for Israel to no longer be directly affected by the plagues. Verses 22 through 24 present this idea like Israel was already segregated from the other Egyptians at the time, in a place called Goshen. And yeah, basically he says from here on out, Goshen is safe from future plagues, which is cool. Anyway, the Egyptian god that would be put under scrutiny here as a result of this being allowed to even happen on their soil would probably be Capri. That's probably how you say it. The God of creation and rebirth. This plague signifies not only another demonstration of God's power, but also shows his grace, as now the Israelites will not only be talked about by Egyptian citizens as this kind of being all their fault. Well, it's all Pharaoh's fault for having them enslaved, but if Israel wasn't even there in the first place, then none of this would be happening. But they'll actually be able to see that Israel is an example of that sentiment. You know what I'm trying to say. What a word salad that was, huh? Did you bring your dressing? Pharaoh's response here is the same as it always has been, aside from a small note about him trying to control the situation in his favor. He says they can sacrifice to God, but they got to do it here in Egypt. Moses pushes back and reminds him of what God said. Pharaoh agrees and then changes his mind again right after the swarms pass. Something I didn't write down here, but maybe it fits here. I hope I didn't write it down so I don't repeat myself. But there's they couldn't have done the sacrifices in the land of Egypt, because as we're going to continue to talk about these gods that the Egyptians worshipped, they put different animals on pedestals, and the same type of animals and cattle that were used in Israel's sacrifices. So you can't just start killing a bunch of animals in a place where they worship the animals. Does that make sense? It would have caused an uproar. It would have been really bad, and that's not. And but I guess I didn't include it in the script because it doesn't really matter, because the command was to let them leave to do it. But whatever. Anyway, next plague. Chapter 9 opens with a culling of Egyptian livestock. Verses 3 and 4 talk about how thy cattle which is in the field, upon the horses, upon the asses, upon the camels, upon the oxen, and upon the sheep are all going to be wiped out. All except for that of the cattle of Israel. This would be in opposition to the Egyptian gods of Hathor and Apis, god of strength, and again, fertility. There's a lot of Egyptian gods here that talk about fertility, and it's kind of it's maybe it's not ironic, and maybe it's not funny because this was a real thing and it was tragic, but fertility and all this stuff's happening to the land, that's gotta suck. Anyway, this one would have really shook Egypt at this time, as if the others didn't already, because it's on the same line as the Nile being corrupted. Livestock was the bread of trade and commerce back then, kind of like how, cash and credit is the currency of today. Egyptians worshipped their cattle, seeing them as the source of wealth, abundance, and economic stability. Verse 7 concludes this plague by mentioning Pharaoh's reaction. Again, his heart was hardened. Chapter 9 continues to reveal more of God's wonders as mentioned in the beginning. Verses 8 through 10 describe the instruction, Aaron, go ahead and throw ashes from the furnace into the air in the sight of Pharaoh. And after he does so, the ash becomes a small dust that covers the land of Egypt. This dust boils upon the Egyptians and speaks to the weakness of the goddess Sekhmet. Sekhmet? Probably Sekhmet. She was known for healing and protection, specifically for keeping diseases away. Could probably throw the goddess known as Isis here. It's probably Isis. It's probably not Isis. Could be, I guess. But, Isis has this reputation of representing medicine, right? Egyptian gods are powerless. The doctors of Egypt themselves can't do anything about the boils, and still Pharaoh won't budge. Because it even says here too, and I thought I had it in here, but I guess I didn't, that the magicians, they can't even stand in the sight of Moses at this point now, because the boils are so bad upon their skin. Anyway, this is where we see the Lord hardening Pharaoh's heart, and he again denies the cries of his own people, preventing Israel from leaving. Verse 13 is the start of the next plague, and this one ain't no joke either, man. God sends from heaven thunder and hail and fire along the ground. The verses paint this picture of the entire land being hit by a huge storm, deadly enough to kill everything from plants to animals to people themselves. It should be noted though, too, here, that in verses 18 through 21, this warning was given a day ahead of time, and there were some Egyptians who heeded the warning and brought their animals, servants, and family members into shelter or out of harm's way. I don't know if I've even said anything like this so far, but, when Moses is telling Pharaoh about this is not like, Pharaoh, can I talk to you for a second over here on the side? No, it's like Moses, if you've seen Prince of Egypt, I have to watch it again to really confirm if it's, I guess, accurate to what I'm reading. A lot of people talk about it as though it is, so it probably is, but I don't know 100%. But at least this idea that Moses is in the front, is like in public saying this. Like, the Egyptians are not, we'll get into this later too, but the Egyptians are not ignorant of, like, who is this, why is this happening? Who is causing this? What is happening? They know, everybody knows. Anyway, tangent, but this one would have struck a nerve for those following gods like Nut, Seth, and Shu, those who represent the sky to varying degrees. And if you think about Egyptian culture and their obsession with the sarcophagus and mummification, shout out The Mummy from Brandon Fraser's The Mummy. I don't know why it's a shout out. Fire coming down would have been terrifying in its own right. Just the idea of burning. Because after all, if your body burns, how can you take anything with you into the afterlife if you believe what the Egyptians used to believe? They might still believe. I don't know. I've never actually talked to an Egyptian. It'd be cool. Are you out there somewhere? Want to have a chat? Still, Pharaoh ignores the warning. Shocker. And when he meets up with Moses again, this time he pleads with Moses to forgive him, saying that if there be no more of these storms, Israel is free to leave. Moses replies in verse 29, saying that once he is gone out of the city, he will spread abroad his hands until the Lord and the thunder, unto the Lord, and the sun and the thunder shall cease. Neither shall there be any more hail, that thou mayest know how the earth is the Lord's. And then you get to verses 30 and 32, which are interesting as well. Moses confidently proclaims that he knows Pharaoh and his servants will not yet fear the Lord God. It mentions too that the flax and the barley were smited, but for the barley was in the ear and the flax was bold, it alludes to this idea that these types of crops were ready to harvest, and so they got wiped out. Just about ready, they were ready to be harvested, and then that's why they got hit. But that the wheat and the rye were not smitten, for they were not yet grown up. And that'll make sense for the next plague. Just give me a second. Anyway, the storms cease, the pattern repeats. Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He still won't let this thing go. Well, this thing being Israel. Next plague. Chapter 10 opens with the next plague on the list, the 8th plague, that being the swarm of locusts. You're probably getting pretty used to how these things start off right by now, right? But I want to look at verse 2 real quick with you before going on. And that thou mayest tell in the ears of thy son and thy son's son what things I have wrought in Egypt, and my signs which I have done amongst them, that ye may know how that I am the Lord. This again ties heavily with the remembrance theme that we've been building on in this episode. They again, and actually I think for most of these plagues, if not all of them, it's been the case, they do this thing of warning today about the plague tomorrow. They tell Pharaoh that if he continues to be resistant to God's command, that even the little crops Egypt has left will be taken away, this time by a swarm of locusts. Egyptian god or gods that are challenged here would be Seth, and I think we already talked about him a second ago, and Neper, N-E-P-E-R, god of chaos and destruction, and god of grain, respectively. Pharaoh responds by telling Moses and Aaron that he has sinned against the Lord and asks for forgiveness. Again, after the locusts are gone, the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart, and Israel is still not allowed to leave. Verse 21 opens with the proclamation of the next plague. Darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt. This one doesn't come with a warning ahead of time, or at least the text doesn't say that it does. Verses 22 through 23 do say that there was a thick darkness over all the land of Egypt for 3 days, so dark that people couldn't see one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. Everybody knows about the Egyptian god Ra, right? I think you can even play as him in Smite. play enough Smite to know if like that's a OP character or not, but he probably is. There are other deities that you can associate with Egyptian worship of the sun itself, but Ra is the big player when it comes to sun, life, and energy. What's the pattern here, folks? We've said it like 8 times, and will number 9 be any different? You know, you guessed it. Surely not. Pharaoh runs back to Moses, and instead of letting them go, says, you can go, but you gotta leave your livestock. Which again, it doesn't work, because he's trying to still have some form of control over the situation. Pharaoh knows, just like how you and I know from reading it over and over again, that Israel needs to leave, take all of Israel with them, and all their cattle to make sacrifices to God. Moses reminds Pharaoh of this, and Pharaoh's heart is again hardened. And the last words he says before the chapter ends to Moses are, man, I don't even want to look at you anymore. Get away from me. And Moses says, all right, that's fine. Yeah, all right. I won't look at you anymore. That's fine. I just think that's funny. This one is a shadow of what was to come in the next plague. While turning off the lights may seem tame after raining literal hail and fire from the sky only a few plagues earlier, this would have scared more people than it would have, directly hurt them like some of the others. And I think that was intentional. The next plague is the most extreme out of the bunch. The death of the firstborn. This final plague technically spans over 2 chapters, being that of Exodus 11 and 12. The basic premise here is that all firstborn living creatures, from cattle and cockroaches to chiefs and commoners in Egypt, were to be slain, if they heeded not the instructions detailed in chapter 12. This was a direct attack on Pharaoh himself. Back then, the reigning Pharaoh was considered a deity all his own, even as far as being the greatest Egyptian god in the bunch, or at least a demigod to a degree in some sources I've read. But striking down the firstborn in the lineage of this person, or the person that held this title, would once and for all declare to all those involved, and those who would learn about these events afterwards, that the Pharaoh does not get to decide who lives and dies. It is God who does that, the God of Israel. You'll often hear it said that the death of Egypt's firstborn was simple retaliation for Pharaoh killing Israelites' sons earlier in Exodus, and like 30 minutes ago in this video. But the text is more careful than that. Pharaoh's first attempt at infant cleansing failed when the midwives feared God and disobeyed him. Remember earlier where we said that? But Pharaoh didn't stop when that happened. He escalated. He turned violence that was originally targeted against Israel's sons into a national policy. Long before the final plague ever comes, God frames the conflict in terms of sonship. Israel is my firstborn. What Pharaoh tried to destroy, God claims as his own. The final plague isn't impulsive vengeance, it's the unavoidable end of a ruler who believed he could decide whose lives mattered. It's the fulfillment of what was warned would happen before the river ever turned red, back in Exodus 4:22 through 23. A final note here is to speak on the implication of the text, stuff that isn't necessarily clarified through the exactness of words, but what can be gained through inference of the whole story. The Egyptians were not oblivious or ignorant to the acts of God by the final plague. We even talked about earlier in previous parts here how Pharaoh's magicians spoke out against his defiant attitude toward Israel, and how during the hail plague, some of the servants of Pharaoh listened to Moses and avoided judgment on themselves. We can also look further into chapter 12, like verse 38, and see that the wording here suggests that not all of Israel were ethnically Israelite. It says, and a mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds, and even very much cattle. While the warning itself was public, and the instructions were given to specifically Israel, Scripture never says Egyptians were forbidden from responding, only that the sign God honored was the blood. Throughout the plagues, those who feared the Lord and acted were spared regardless of who they were. It focuses heavy on the Israel side here due to the point of the story being about covenant formation and not Egyptian repentance. The Passover is not just a get-out-of-death-free card. much like how accepting Christ into your life today isn't just about avoiding going to hell. In both cases, the act isn't merely about surviving judgment, but about placing trust in God's provision and stepping into the life He is forming beyond it. The narrative lens stays on Israel because God is forming a people, not just ending a crisis. When looking back over all that was discussed, we can now see that this isn't just some random destruction, but rather systematic deconstruction of Egyptian society. All of which was preventable if their leader wasn't so set on making an enemy of their greatest friends. This all really hits harder when you go back to the last leg of Genesis and learn about how much Joseph helped Egypt get to their greatest empire in the world status. If this new pharaoh during the plague saga would have listened to his own history instead of being afraid of what could happen, things would have looked much different for Egypt at this time, like during this time. But, hey, what do we say about the Cain and Abel thing and probably about some other things before, hindsight and speculation to an extent, right? Yeah, probably. It can be really easy to beat up on Pharaoh after all of this too, especially given that even when he finally lets the Israelites go, he does, by the way. I don't know, did I say it at the end of the last plague? He does. After the firstborns all die, he lets them go. That's the last straw for Pharaoh. Anyway, after he finally lets them go, he chased them down to the Red Sea, where he loses a ton of men in the parting of said sea. But anyway, I don't think beating up on Pharaoh is the good takeaway to have here. Pharaoh's pride isn't put on display to show our moral superiority to him. It's meant to warn us. From the inside, I'm sure Pharaoh thought that the potential of Israel going rogue and turning on his empire was reasonable enough to try to control these people through slavery. I'm not saying I think it was right, I'm just saying I think it's logical to come to that conclusion and to try it. Not that it's a good, okay, nobody thinks that you think slavery is good. Okay, thanks, appreciate it. But when the plagues start hitting, he probably had every thought in the world clogging his mind, saying, okay, this has to just be a coincidence, or surely this can't get any worse. Or more than likely, if I keep telling them one thing and the pain stops, and I survived the last pain, I can both keep my power over the situation and prevent my own nightmare scenario from coming true. This is what hardness of the heart looks like most of the time. It doesn't feel like rebellion, it feels like self-preservation. It doesn't announce itself as pride, it disguises itself as caution, control, or just getting through this one more time. And this is where the story stops being about Pharaoh. Because once Israel's free, the same pattern doesn't disappear, but instead follows them into the wilderness. This isn't about a disbelief in God's power, but about resistance to trusting Him when the cost of doing so feels greater than what He can do. And that's why the psalmist in Psalm 78 isn't asking what God did. He's asking how, after all this, could the children of Israel still have hardened their hearts toward Him. Psalm 95:10 doesn't add any new information to the story, and that's on purpose. By the time we get here, nothing in this verse is really surprising. The power has already been shown to both Israelite and outsider alike. The faithfulness to promises made from God has already been proven, and these miracles are established parts of Israel's collective memory. That's also part of why this psalm is unsettling. Notice the wording here, even if we back up a few verses. Harden not your heart, as in the provocation, as in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my work. 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, and said, it is a people that do err in their heart, and have not known my ways. For 40 whole years I was grieved with that generation. A spread out amount of time, not a flash in the pan, knee-jerk reaction, not a feeling of surprise towards rebellion or disobedience. Grieved. This is not the voice of a God reacting to failure. It is the voice of one who watched, waited, provided, warned, and still wasn't trusted. A God who didn't just lead his people out of decades of slavery, but carried them through the wilderness day after day after day, just to be met with the same resistance again and again and again. Psalm 95 reframes the problem. Israel wasn't in a spot of needing more signs and miracles. They had seen more than what was called for, and arguably more than they deserved, given what we've discussed about what happened after creation in Genesis. Verse 10 reveals the real problem wasn't Egypt, it wasn't Pharaoh, and it wasn't even the wilderness itself. It was a people who learned how to survive in God's provision, but never learned how to trust His presence. They didn't need more evidence, they needed a change in heart. It didn't matter how many times God showed up for them, because they did not fundamentally understand who He is, not by His own words or by the actions He chose to partake in. This story isn't about ignorance. It's a warning about what happens when remembrance fades into routine. And that hits home for me as this video comes to a close. As for you, you do whatever you want with whatever feeling you have, after coming out of all this. I know it was a lot of information, but whatever you're doing is none of my business. But if you want to talk about it, I'm always here. Thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of this, or I hope you get something out of this. Next week, we have the verse in 1 Samuel, I believe. And that one's going to be cool, too, I think. I already have most of that. I got some stuff. But take care of yourself in the meantime. I'll see you later. I love you. See you.